Alright, so I'm going to be finding the exact value of cosine of 22.5. So looking at that, I have to make a couple of decisions. The first decision is I have to figure out which formula I'm going to use. And in order to do that, I have to know how did I get to 22.5. Well, I know that 22.5 did not come just straight off my unit circle because nothing on my unit circle ends in 0.5. Okay, I also know for that same reason that I didn't have the sum or difference. So I know that I'm either dealing with a half angle here or I'm dealing with a double angle. Okay, well, if I take 22.5 and I divide it by 2, that doesn't work. That gives me something that ends in 0.25, and again, there's nothing on my unit circle that does that. But if I take 22.5 and I multiply it by 2, I see that that does get me to 45 degrees, and that is something that I can work with on my unit circle. So now that I know that, the next thing I need to do is I need to figure out what the points are that are associated with 45 degrees. Well, I know that if I'm going to use my hand trick, I know that that's my middle finger that's getting put down. So I know that I'm dealing with the points of root 2, comma, and root 2. Okay, so that was the first decision I had to make. Second decision, now I have to look at it and I have to decide what formula I'm going to use. So if I look on my formula sheet, I see that I have the formula cosine of theta divided by 2 is equal to plus or minus 1 plus the cosine of x divided by 2. Alright, so I'm going to plug that in. So I've got is equal to plus or minus, and we'll talk about the plus or minus in just a moment, 1 plus the cosine of 45 degrees all over 2. Alright, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite 1 as 2 over 2. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put in root 2 over 2. If you have any questions as to why I did that, please come see me. So my next line is plus or minus 2 plus root 2 over 2 times 1/2. Alright, so now I'm down to simplification. Plus or minus 2 plus root 2 over 4. Okay. Well, I know that I cannot have a radical on the bottom. I know that this right here is a problem for me. Okay, so I'm going to fix it by taking the square root of the top and the bottom. Alright, so on the top, I've got the square root of 2 plus root 2. And on the bottom, I have the square root of 4, which is 2. So now it's time to come back to this plus or minus. So if I think about where 22.5 lays in my unit circle, it lays in this first quadrant right here. So that means that cosine is positive and sine is positive. So that means that I'm going to take the positive root. So my final answer is the positive root 2 plus root 2 over 2. Alright, so now we're going to take a look at what this looks like on your test. We've been asked to find the exact value of this thing right here. 2 times sine squared of 67.5 minus 3 times cosine squared of 67.5. Alright, so when I look at this, again, I've got to make these same decisions about how did I get to 67.5? Did I add something? Did I subtract something? Did I multiply by 2? Did I divide by 2? Well, I see that because this is a 0.5, I see that that means that I divided by 2. So if I take 67.5 and I multiply it by 2, I get 135 degrees. Right. So I also know that the points for 135 degrees are root 2 over 2 and root 2 over 2 because they lay on the 45 degree. But these things are in quadrant 2. So in quadrant 2, cosine is negative and sine is positive. All right, so now I'm also going to go to my formula sheet, and I see that on my formula sheet I'm actually going to have to use two different formulas. And the reason I'm going to have to use two different formulas is because one of these is sine and the other one is cosine. So I know that the sine of half theta is equal to plus or minus the square root of 1 minus the cosine of x divided by 2. And I know that the cosine of half theta is equal to plus or minus the root of 1 plus the cosine of x. And I want to remind you that you do not have to memorize these. These are on your formula sheet and you can pull them straight off of there. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start plugging some things in. So I know that I've got 2 times this thing right here. So 2 times plus or minus root 1 minus the cosine of 135 degrees divided by 2. Close my parentheses and don't forget your squared. Minus 3 times plus or minus root 1 plus the cosine of 135 degrees divided by 2. Don't forget your squared. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say that because this is squared, it's not going to matter if I take the plus or minus. Because if I take the positive, a positive squared is a positive, and if I take the negative, a negative squared is a negative. So that's one way we can simplify our problem. So let's go ahead and plug in the things that we know. So 2 times, and I'm going to go ahead and write 1 as 2 over 2. So 2 over 2 minus the cosine of 135 degrees, which is negative root 2 over 2, all divided by 2, close it, square it, minus 3 times the square root, again I'm going to go ahead and write 2 over 2, plus the cosine of 135 degrees, which is root 2 over 2, all over 2, and again I'm going to square it. Alright, so my next line is going to be to go ahead and combine some things, and at the same time I'm also going to go ahead and get rid of that root. Okay, so I'm going to close this parentheses, and I'm going to go ahead and say that that's going to be 2 plus root 2 over 2, and I'm going to multiply by 1/2, because multiplying by 1/2 is the same thing as dividing by 2, minus 3, and I've got 2 minus root 2 over 2 times 1/2. And because I got rid of the radical sign, I can go ahead and get rid of that squared as well. Alright, so now I've got 2 times 2 plus root 2 over 4 minus 3 times 2 minus root 2 over 4. Okay, my last thing is going to be to distribute those numbers out in front. So I've got 2 times 2 is 4 plus 2 root 2, and it's all going to be over 4. Negative 3 times 2 is negative 6, and then a negative and a negative make positive 3 root 2. Okay, one more step, and that step is just going to be to put the things together that can go together. Okay, so my next things that can go together is I can go ahead and I can say positive 4, negative 6. That's going to give me negative 2 plus 5 root 2 all over 4. And this is going to be my final answer.